Well, good afternoon. Today we start a new commentary on the book of 1 Kings, which was originally called the third book of the kingdoms. We'll start today with an introduction. There's a lot in this book that you need to understand before we start. This summary of the book of 1 Kings provides information about the title, the author or authors, the date of writing, the chronology, the theme, the theology, outline, and a brief overview of the chapters of the book of 1 Kings. The title, 1 and 2 Kings, like 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Chronicles, are actually one literary work, called in Hebrew tradition simply Kings. The division of this work into two books was introduced by the translators of the Septuagint, the pre-Christian Greek translation of the Old Testament, and subsequently followed in the Latin Vulgate approximately 400 AD, and most modern versions. In 1448 AD, the divisions into two sections also appeared in a Hebrew manuscript and was perpetuated in later printed editions of the Hebrew text. Both the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate further designated Samuel and Kings in a way that emphasized the relationship of these two works. The Septuagint calls the first, second, third, and fourth book of kingdoms. The Latin Vulgate, the first, second, and third, and fourth kings. Together, Samuel and Kings relates to the whole history of the monarchy, from its rise under the ministry of Samuel to its fall at the hand of the Babylonians. The division between 1 and 2 Kings has been made at a somewhat arbitrary and yet appropriate place, shortly after the death of Ahab on the northern kingdom. It's found in 1 Kings 22:37, and Jehoshaphat the second kingdom in 22:50. Placing the divisions of this point causes the account of the reign of Ahaziah of Israel to overlap the one of 1 Kings 22:51-53 and the beginning of 2 Kings chapter 1. The same is true of the narration of the ministry of Elijah, which for the most part appears in 1 Kings chapters 17 and 19. However, his final act of judgment and the passing of his cloak to Elisha at the moment of his ascension to heaven in a whirlwind are contained in 2 Kings chapter 1 verses 1 all the way through to chapter 2:17. Author, source, and date. There is little conclusive evidence as to the identity of the author of 1 and 2 Kings, although Jewish tradition credits Jeremiah the prophet. Few today accept this as likely. However, the author, whoever he was, it is clear he was familiar with the books of Deuteronomy, as were many of the Israeli prophets. It is also clear that he used a variety of sources in compiling his history of the monarchy. 3 of such sources are named in the book of the Annals of Solomon in chapter 11 verse 41. The book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel in 14 verse 19, and the book of the Annals of the Kings of Judah in chapter 14:29. It is likely that other written sources were also employed, such as mentioned in 1 Chronicles, see below. Although some scholars have concluded that the 3 sources specifically cited in 1-2 Kings are to be viewed as official court annals from the royal archives in Jerusalem and Samaria, this is by no means certain. It seems at least questionable whether official court annals would have included details of conspiracies such as those referred to in chapter 16 verse 20 and 2 Kings 15:15. It is also questionable whether official court annals would have been readily accessible for public scrutiny, as the author clearly implies in his references to them. Such considerations have led some scholars to conclude that these sources were probably records of the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah, compiled by the succession of Israeli prophets, spanning the kingdom period of 1 and 2 Chronicles makes reference to a number of such writings. The records of Samuel the seer, the records of Nathan the prophet, and the records of Gad the seer, 1 Chronicles chapter 29:29, the prophecies of Ahijah the Silonite, and the visions of Iddo the seer, 2 Chronicles 9:29. The records of Shemaiah the prophet, 2 Chronicles 12:15. The annals of Jehu the son of Hanani, 2 Chronicles 20:34. The annotations on the Book of Kings, 2 Chronicles 24:27, and the events of Uzziah's reign recorded by the prophet Isaiah son of Amos, 2 Chronicles 26:22. See also 2 Chronicles 32:32. There are maybe many others. It is more likely, for example, that for the ministries of Elijah and Elisha, the author depended on a prophetic source, perhaps from the 8th century, that had drawn up an account of those two prophets in which they were already compared with Moses and Joshua. Some scholars place the date of composition of 1 and 2 Kings in the time subsequent to Jehoiakim's release from prison in 562 BC. This is 2 Kings 25:27-30, and prior to the end of the Babylonian exile in 538 BC. This position is challenged by others on the basis of statements in 1 and 2 Kings that speak of certain things in the pre-exilic period that are said to have continued in existence to this day. Example is chapter 8, verse 8. The poles used to carry the ark, 9:20-21. Conscripted labor, 12:19. Israel in rebellion against the house of David, 2 Kings 8:22. Edom in rebellion against the kingdom of Judah. From such statements it is argued that the writer must have been a person living in Judah in the pre-exilic period rather than in Babylon in post-exilic times. In other words, the guy had to still be in Judah or in Israel before the exile, not in Babylon during the exile. In this argument, it is accepted one must conclude that the original book was composed about the time of the death of Josiah, and that the material pertaining to the time subsequent to his reign was added during the exile in 555 BC. While this two-edition viewpoint is possible, it rests largely on to this day statements. An alternative is to understand these statements as though of the original source by the author rather than the statements of the author himself. A comparison of 2 Chronicles 5:9 with 1 Kings 8:8 suggests that this is a legitimate conclusion. Chronicles is clearly a post-exilic writing, yet the wording of the statement concerning the poles used to carry the ark, they are still there today, is the same as Chronicles as it is in Kings. Probably the chronicler was simply quoting his source, namely 1 Kings 8:8. There is no reason for the author of 1 King and 2 Kings could not have done the same thing in quoting from his earlier sources. This explanation allows for posting and positioning of single author living in exile and using the source materials at his disposal. So, theme, kingship and covenant. 1 and 2 Kings contains no explicit statements on purpose or theme. Reflection on its content, however, reveals that the author has selected and arranged his material in a manner that provides a sequel to the history found in 1 and 2 Samuel. A history of kingship relegated by covenant. In general, 1 and 2 Kings describe the history of the kings of Israel and Judah in the light of God's covenants. The guiding thesis of the book is that the welfare of Israel and her kings depended on their submission to and reliance on Israel's covenant God, their obedience to the Sinaitic covenant, regulations and their faithful response to God's prophets. It is clearly not the author's intention to present a social, political and economic history of Israel's monarchy, in accordance with the principles of modern historiography. The author repeatedly refers the reader to other sources for more detailed information about the reigns of the various kings. See chapter 11:41, chapter 14:19-29, chapter 15:7-31, chapter 16:5, 14, 20 and 27, and he gives a covenantal rather than social or political or economic assessment of their reigns. From the standpoint of a political historian, Omri would be considered one of or the more important rulers in the northern kingdom. He established a powerful dynasty and made Samaria the capital city. According to the Moabite stone, Omri was the ruler who subjugated the Moabites to the northern kingdom. Long after Omri's death, Assyrian rulers referred to Jehu as the son of Omri, either mistakenly or merely in accordance with their literary conventions when speaking of a later king of a realm. Yet in spite of Omri's political importance, his reign is dismissed in just 6 verses. Chapter 16, verses 23 to 28. When the statement that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord and sinned more than all of those before him, chapter 16, verse 25. Similarly, the reign of Jeroboam II, who presided over the northern kingdom during the time of its greatest political and economic power, is treated only briefly in 2 Kings 14, chapter 14, verses 23 to 29, just 6 verses. Another example of the writer's covenantal rather than merely political or economic interest can be seen in the description of the reign of Josiah of Judah. Nothing is said about the earlier years of his reign, but a detailed description is given of the reformation and renewal of the covenant that he promoted in his 18th year as king. See 2 Kings chapter 22, verses 3 through to 23, verse 28. Nor is anything said of the motives leading to Josiah to propose Pharaoh Necho of Egypt at Megiddo, or of the major shift in geopolitical power from Assyria to Babylon that was connected with this incident. See the notes on chapter 2 Kings 23, verses 29 and 30. It becomes apparent then that the kings who receive the most attention in 1 and 2 Kings are those during whose reigns there was either notable deviation from or affirmation of the covenant, or significant interactions between a king and God's prophet. See below. Ahab, son of Omri, is an example of the former. Chapter 16, 29 to chapter 22, 39. So you get 6 chapters about him. His reign is given extensive treatment, not so much because of its extraordinary political importance, but because of the serious threat of covenant fidelity and continuity that arose in the northern kingdom during his reign. Ultimately, the pagan influence of Ahab's wife, Jezebel, through Ahab's daughter, Athaliah, whether she was Jezebel's daughter is unknown, nearly led to the extermination of the house of David in Judah. See 2 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 to 3. Manasseh, 2 Kings 21, verses 1 to 18, is an example of a similar sort. Here again, it is deviation from the covenant that is emphasized in the account of his reign rather than political features, such as involvement in the Assyrian-Egyptian conflict, mentioned in Assyrian records but not in 2 Kings. The extreme apostasy characterizing Manasseh's reign made exile for Judah inevitable. This is recorded in 2 Kings chapter 21, 10 to 15, chapter 23, 26 to 27. On the positive side, we get some positive now. Hezekiah chapter 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 1, all the way through to chapter 20, verse 21. And Josiah, 2 Kings chapter 22, verse 1, all through to 23, verse 29, are given extensive treatment because of their involvement in covenant renewal. These are the only 2 kings given unqualified approval by the writer for their loyalty to the Lord. 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 3, and 2 Kings chapter 22, verse 2. It is noteworthy that all of the kings of the northern kingdom are said to have done evil in the eyes of the Lord and walked in the ways of Jeroboam, who caused Israel to sin. See 16 verse 26-31, chapter 22 verse 52, 2 Kings chapter 3 verse 3, 2 Kings chapter 10 verse 29. It was Jeroboam who established the golden calf worship at Bethel and Dan shortly after the division of the kingdom. See chapter 12, 26 to 33 and chapter 13, 1 to 6. And this is the reason why the tribe of Dan is not included in the book of Revelations of one of the 12 tribes going into heaven. While the writer depicts Israel's obedience or disobedience to the Sinai covenant as decisive for her historical destiny, he also recognizes the far-reaching historical significance of the Davidic covenant, which promises that David's dynasty would endure forever. This is particularly noticeable in references to the lamp that the Lord had promised David. See chapter 11 verse 36 and note chapter 15 verse 4, 2 Kings 8 verse 19. So also the notes in 2 Samuel chapter 21 verse 17. It also appears in more general references to the promises of David in chapter 8 verse 20 and 25 and in its consequences for specific historical development. In Judah's later history, chapter 11 verse 12 through 13 and 32, 2 Kings 19:34 and chapter 20 verse 6. In addition, the writer uses the life and reign of David as a standard by which the lives of later kings are measured. For example, chapter 9 verse 4, chapter 11 verses 4, 6, 33, 38, chapter 14 verse 8, chapter 15 verses 3, 5 and 11, 2 Kings chapter 16 verse 2, chapter 18 verse 3 and 22 verse 2. Another prominent feature of the narrative of 1-2 Kings is the emphasis on the relationship between prophecy and fulfillment in the historical development of the monarchy. On at least 11 occasions a prophecy is recorded that is later said to have been fulfilled. And for example, we have 2 Samuel 7:13 and 1 Kings 8:20, 1 Kings 11:29 to 39, and 1 Kings 12:15, 1 Kings chapter 13, and 2 Kings 23 to 16 to 18. The result of this emphasis is that the history of the kingdom is not presented as a change of chance occurrences or the mere interplay of human actions, but as the unfolding of Israel's historical destiny under the guidance of an omniscient and omnipotent God. Israel's covenant Lord, who rules all history in accordance with his sovereign purposes. See chapter 8 verse 56 and 2 Kings 10:10. God's got a plan, and this records the history of that plan being put into motion and being fulfilled according to God's time plan. The author also stresses the importance of the prophets themselves in their role as official emissaries from the court of Israel covenant Lord, the great king to whom Israel and her king were bound in service throughout the covenant. The Lord sent a long succession of such prophets to call king and people back to covenant loyalty. 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 13. For the most part, their warnings and exhortations fell on deaf ears because the people were rebellious. Many of these prophets are mentioned in the narratives of 1 and 2 Kings. For example, Abijah in chapter 11, 29 and 40, in chapter 14, 5 through 18, Shemaiah chapter 12, verses 22 to 24, Micaiah chapter 22, 8 to 28, Jonah chapter 2 Kings 14 and 25, Isaiah 2 Kings chapter 19 verses 1 to 7 and chapter 20 verse 34, Huldah 2 Kings 22, 14 to 20. But particular attention is given to the ministries of Elijah and Elisha. 1 Kings 7 chapters 17 to 19 and 2 Kings chapters 1 to 13. Reflection on these features of 1 and 2 Kings suggests that it was written to explain to the people in exile that the reason for their condition of humiliation was their stubborn persistence in breaking the covenant. in being rebellious against God. In bringing the exile upon his people, God, after much patience, imposed the curses of the covenant, which had stood as a warning to them from the beginning. See Leviticus chapter 26, verses 27 to 45, and Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 64 to 68. This is made explicit with respect to the captivity of the northern kingdom in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 through 23, and chapter 18, verses 9 through 12. And with respect to the southern kingdom in 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 12 to 15. The Reformation under Josiah in the southern kingdom is viewed as too little too late. See 2 Kings 23, 26 to 27 and chapter 24, verse 3. The book then provides a retrospective analysis of Israel's history. It explains the reasons both for the destruction of Samaria and Jerusalem and their respective kingdoms, and for the bitter experience of being forced into exile. This does not mean, however, that there was no hope for a future. The writer consistently keeps the promise to David in view as a basis on which Israel in exile may look to the future with hope rather than with despair. In this connection, the final 4 verses of the book, reporting Joachim's release from prison in Babylon and his elevation to a place of honor in the court there, 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 27 to 30, take on added significance. The future remains open for a new work of the Lord in faithfulness to his promise to the house of David. It is important to note that although the author was undoubtedly a Judahite exile, and although the northern kingdom had been dispersed for well over a century and a half at the time of his writing, the scope of his concern was all Israel, the whole covenant people, neither he nor the prophets. See Isaiah chapter 10 verses 20 to 21, chapter 11 verses 11 to 13, Jeremiah chapter 31, Ezekiel chapter 48 through 129, and Hosea chapter 11, 8 to 11, Amos chapter 9 verse 11 to 15, and Zechariah chapter 9 verse 10 to 13. They all viewed the decision of the Israel kingdom as a divine rejection of the 10 tribes. Nor did they see the earlier exile of the northern kingdom as a final exclusion of the northern tribes from Israel's future. As a matter of fact, many from the north had fled south during the Assyrian invasions, so that a significant remnant of the northern tribes lived on in the kingdom of Judah and shared in its continuing history. Chronology. 1 Kings presents the reader with an abundant chronological data. Not only is the length of the reign of each king given, but during the period of the divided kingdom, the beginning of the reign of each king is synchronized with the regnal year of the ruling king in the opposite kingdom. Often additional data, such as the age of the ruler at the time of his ascension, is also provided. By integrating biblical data with those derived from Assyrian chronological records, the year 853 BC can be fixed as the year of Ahab's death, and 841 as the year Jehu began to reign. The years in which Ahab and Jehu had contacts with Shalmaneser III of Assyria can also be definite dates by means of astronomical calculations based on an Assyrian reference to a solar eclipse. With these fixed points, it is then possible to work forward and backwards in the line of the kings of Israel and Judah to give gates for each king. By the same means, it can be determined that the division of the kingdoms occurred in 930 BC, that Samaria fell to the Assyrians in 722-721 BC, and that Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians in 586 BC. The synchronistic data correlating the rules of the kings of Israel and Judah presents some knotty problems, which have long been considered nearly insolvable. In more recent times, most of these problems have been resolved in a satisfactory way through recognizing such possibilities of overlapping reigns. Corrigency of sons with their fathers, differences in the times of the years in which the reign of a king officially began, and differences in the way a king's first year was reckoned. That is, see notes on chapter 15 verse 33 and 2 Kings 8 verse 25. Historical significance. Some skeptics state that there is no historical evidence of the Bible that King David or King Solomon ever really existed in history. Well, I believe they existed because I believe that God's word is true. Because Jesus, from the root of Jesse, is the word of God made flesh among us. And in the next session, we'll start with chapter 1. David is old. Adonijah decides he wants to be king in his place.